You know, the American presidency isn't just a list of 46 names you have to memorize. It's really a single, continuous story of a nation that's faced one huge test after another. So today, we're going to journey through that story, from the very beginning all the way to now, to see how this one job was forged in the fire of crisis.
And we're going to keep this one big question in mind the whole time. Because really, at its core, the history of the presidency is a history of crisis and response. How each of these leaders met their moment, that's what defined not only their own legacy, but the course of the entire nation.
All right, so let's start at the very beginning. The first test was the most basic one you can imagine. Can this even work? After the revolution, there was absolutely no guarantee this new American experiment would last. The first few presidents literally had to build a working country from scratch. And in just a few decades, they took this fragile idea and gave it real physical form. You had Washington's inauguration setting up stability, the Louisiana Purchase giving the country room to grow, and then the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told the world to back off. These weren't just random events. They were the essential building blocks of a new nation. And it all started with this guy. You know, George Washington's most important legacy wasn't even winning the war. It was what he did as president. He created the first cabinet, and maybe most crucially, he stepped down peacefully. That act alone set a precedent that proved the Republic could outlast any one person. He absolutely set the standard for everyone who followed.
So with Washington having created that stability, the next guys got busy defining America's place in the world. Thomas Jefferson went out and literally doubled the country's size. Then you have James Madison, who proved the U.S. could actually go toe-to-toe with a global empire and survive. And finally, James Monroe drew a line in the sand and told European powers this hemisphere was off limits. Just like that, in a few short decades, the presidency had turned a revolutionary idea into a stable, growing nation.
But as the nation got bigger, so did the cracks on the inside. And this brings us to the second great test, a question that almost undid everything. Could the nation actually survive being torn apart from the inside? I mean, this timeline, it just shows a country barreling toward disaster. You have deeply controversial policies like the Indian Removal Act, huge new territories from the Mexican-American War that just threw gasoline on the fire of the slavery debate. Each event pushed the country closer and closer to the edge, until finally, in 1861, it went right over. What you really see in this period is a failure of presidential leadership. You had powerful but incredibly divisive figures like Andrew Jackson, who just made tensions worse. Then expansionists like James K. Polk, who grabbed more land that only made the slavery debate more intense. And after them, you just had a string of presidents who either couldn't or wouldn't face the crisis head on. With every passing administration, war just became more and more inevitable. And then came the man who had to face that ultimate test. Abraham Lincoln's entire presidency was defined by one single, all-consuming goal: preserving the Union. And his actions were just monumental. He guided the nation through its absolute bloodiest war. He completely redefined what freedom meant in America with the Emancipation Proclamation, but his assassination, it left a deeply wounded country without the one leader it desperately needed to even begin the painful process of healing and reconstruction. So, with the Union preserved, but definitely scarred, America enters this new phase of massive industrial growth. And this leads us to the third great test for the presidency. As the U.S. becomes a global power, what is it supposed to do with all that new strength? As you can see here, America's time of just keeping to itself was pretty much over. The Spanish-American War suddenly made it an overseas power, it got reluctantly dragged into World War I, and after a completely devastating economic depression, it would rise from the ashes of World War II as one of the two dominant superpowers on the entire planet. And maybe no one embodied this new American energy more than Theodore Roosevelt. The man was just a force of nature, right? Busting up monopolies, championing conservation, and projecting American power all over the globe with things like the Panama Canal. He was the perfect president for a nation that was really starting to feel its own strength. But that strength was completely shattered by the Great Depression, and this forced a huge change in how people thought about the presidency. Herbert Hoover's more traditional, hands-off approach, it just failed to stop the collapse. So in his place, you get Franklin D. Roosevelt, who argued that a crisis this huge demanded direct, massive, and immediate action from the White House itself. FDR's impact was just staggering. I mean, he was elected 4 times. He completely transformed the government's role in American life, with the New Deal, and then he led the Allies through most of World War II. His successor, Harry Truman, inherited this brand new world, and he was the one who had to make the decisions to end the war and then shape our entire strategy for the new Cold War. And that brings us to our final era, and the fourth great test, one that, let's be honest, is still going on today. In a world with nuclear weapons, instant global communication, and deep, deep political divisions at home, how does a president even begin to lead? The crises of the modern age are just so complex and so different from each other. Look at the major flashpoints here. The entire world holding its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a total crisis of faith in government with Watergate, the incredible triumph when the Cold War ended, and then the dawn of a whole new era of conflict on 9/11. For decades, the Cold War was the challenge. It shaped everything. It brought John F. Kennedy to the absolute brink of nuclear war, and it completely consumed Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency with the incredibly divisive war in Vietnam, which overshadowed all of his huge achievements on civil rights back home. But the greatest challenge to the office can also come from the inside. Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal and this one infamous line just shattered the public's trust in the presidency in a way that had never happened before. It led, of course, to his historic resignation. So, in the aftermath of all that, Ronald Reagan came along with a very different message of optimism and conservative renewal. His presidency really reshaped American politics, and through a mix of military pressure and diplomacy, he played a pretty central role in writing the final chapter of the Cold War. And that brings us right up to the 21st century, where the tests have just gotten faster, more global, and honestly, a lot more divisive. The 9/11 attacks instantly redefined George W. Bush's presidency around war and terrorism. A massive financial crisis and a landmark healthcare bill shaped Barack Obama's 2 terms. Donald Trump's America First agenda challenged a lot of old norms and deepened political polarization. And most recently, Joe Biden's presidency has really been defined by the COVID pandemic and major domestic policy on infrastructure and climate. So from literally creating a nation to holding it together, from figuring out its role in the world to navigating our incredibly complex modern age, the presidency has always been an office forged by crisis. The big takeaway here is that the job is never static. It's always being reshaped by the challenges of the moment. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. What will be its next great test?